Black girl plays in cornfield and goes missing 10 years later. Mother goes into pig pen and finds. The sun hung low over the dusty fields of Alabama, casting a golden-orange hue across the sprawling cornfields that stretched endlessly towards the horizon. It was late August, the season when the air was thick with heat and the soil underfoot was dry cracked, as though the earth itself had given up on trying to hold any moisture. The breeze, though barely a whisper, carried with it the scent of aging crops' dust and the faintest hint of manure from the nearby barns. Maggie Landry stood at the edge of the farm, her worn boots digging into the soil as she gazed out at the distant barn. She could almost hear the faint grunting of the pigs, the scratching of the chickens, and the distant hum of the cicadas as they sang their evening song. The land, though familiar, felt foreign to her in that moment. It had been 10 long years since she had set foot on this stretch of land, without the crushing weight of loss hanging over her. 10 years since the day her daughter Fiona disappeared. It was a warm spring day when Fiona went missing, the kind of day that made you forget your troubles as the sun beat down on the back of your neck, and the scent of fresh earth and growing things filled the air. The fields were alive, vibrant with the promise of a good harvest, and the air hummed with the soft buzz of bees. Maggie had sent Fiona, barely 2 years old at the time, out to play near the old oak tree that stood at the edge of the field. It was their routine, a daily ritual of sorts. Fiona loved to chase the butterflies that fluttered around the tree, her chubby legs stumbling through the grass. It was peaceful, it was safe, but that day Maggie had felt a strange pull in her gut. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. It wasn't the first time Fiona had wandered off a little further than usual, but that day was different. Maggie had been busy, her hands full with chores, and she didn't notice the time slipping by. By the time she went looking for Fiona, it was too late. The search that followed was long desperate and fruitless. The entire town rallied together, combing through the fields, the woods, and every barn on the farm. They searched the old creek beds, the abandoned shacks at the far end of the property, but there was no sign of her, no trace, nothing. And then the whispers started. The town had its own secrets, its own history. People spoke in hushed tones about old grudges, land disputes, and families at odds for generations. Maggie and her husband Hank had never been well liked in this town, but they had never thought that anyone would go so far as to take their child. Yet the rumors wouldn't stop. The townsfolk had their suspicions about neighbors, about friends, about the land around them. But most of all, they whispered about the Becker family. Clay Becker was a man who seemed to live in the shadow of his family's wealth and power. The Becker name had been synonymous with land, money, and influence in the town for generations. They owned vast stretches of farmland, sprawling estates that stretched as far as the eye could see. Their wealth had only grown in the last few decades, with the rise of industrial farming and the quiet but steady consolidation of smaller plots of land. But with wealth came pride, and with pride came conflict. Clay's family had always been a source of tension in the town, especially between the Beckers and the Landrys. Maggie and Hank's family had been here for just as long, though they were never as prosperous, never as ingrained in the fabric of the town's power structure. The two families had clashed over property lines, over water rights, and over who controlled the local farming market. For years, those disputes had festered just beneath the surface, never fully boiling over, but always simmering. Clay, for his part, was a quiet man. He didn't speak much, and when he did, it was usually to throw a barb or a comment that left others on edge. Maggie had never trusted him, and Hank was always wary of the way Clay looked at them, especially after Fiona went missing. There had always been something in Clay's eyes, a strange glint, something hard to define but impossible to ignore, as if he knew something they didn't. It wasn't until Maggie found the first clue, 10 years after Fiona's disappearance, that the pieces started to come together. It wasn't much, just a small faded headband, a pink child's headband with a single flower on it. Maggie had been cleaning out the attic of their old farmhouse, sorting through boxes of memories, when she found it tucked away inside an old shoebox. At first it didn't register, but then she froze. She could still remember Fiona wearing that headband. It was her favorite. She had worn it every day, a little crown of flowers that made her look like a tiny princess. That was when Maggie's heart started to race. That was when the knot in her stomach returned. She knew what she had to do. Maggie picked up the phone, her hands shaking as she dialed the number she had avoided for so long, the number for the local sheriff's department. She had tried to move on after all these years, to accept that Fiona was gone and never coming back. But the headband, it was too much. It meant something more than just a piece of forgotten childhood. Sheriff Jenkins, the voice on the other end, answered. "It's Maggie Landry," she said, her voice tight. I think I've found something. Found something about Fiona." There was a long pause before the sheriff spoke again. "Are you sure about this, Maggie?" "It's been a long time. The case has gone cold." "I'm sure," she replied, her voice steady now. "I need you to come. I need you to come and see." The sheriff arrived the next morning, a broad man in his late 40s, with salt and pepper hair and a weary expression. He had been the one to oversee the search for Fiona all those years ago, and he had never truly given up on the case, even when everyone else had. Maggie had always felt a strange connection to him, a bond forged through shared loss and quiet determination. They met in the barn behind the farmhouse, the place where Maggie had spent so many years working beside Hank. The barn was quiet now, save for the occasional scurry of rats and the rustling of old hay. Maggie handed the sheriff the headband, watching as his eyes scanned it, his expression unreadable. "This is Fiona's," he said. After a long pause, his voice heavy with something Maggie couldn't quite place. "Where did you find this?" "I found it in the attic," she replied. "It was in an old box. I thought I'd gotten rid of everything from when she disappeared, but I guess I didn't." Sheriff Jenkins ran a hand through his hair, his brow furrowed in thought. "This changes things," he muttered. "We need to investigate this. For now, keep this to yourself, Maggie. I'll need to talk to Clay Becker." Maggie didn't argue. She knew where that conversation would lead, and she knew deep down that this was just the beginning. As the sheriff made his way to the Becker farm, Maggie sat in the quiet of her home, her mind racing. She knew that if Clay Becker had anything to do with Fiona's disappearance, the entire town would be forced to face a truth it had long ignored, the truth that power, privilege, and prejudice had shaped the way things worked here, the truth that the Beckers had always been above the law and that people like her and Hank, the working poor, had never stood a chance. She thought back to the whispers, the little things that had never made sense, the way the Becker family always seemed to have too much, the way their land seemed to stretch further every year, how no one ever questioned how they could amass such wealth in a place where the soil was becoming barren, where the crops were failing. There were always rumors, whispers about land deals, about who really owned what, about deals made under the table. Maggie never believed those rumors, not until now. And now, with that headband in her hands, she felt the weight of a decade of unanswered questions pressing down on her chest. She had found something, and she wouldn't stop until she found her daughter. The hum of the cicadas filled the still air as Sheriff Jenkins drove down the winding dirt road toward the Becker farm. The large, looming farmhouse appeared ahead, its weathered wooden siding an old memory of better times. The Beckers' land was vast, stretching for miles in all directions, peppered with barns, fields of corn, and rows of cotton that barely seemed to yield anymore. It was the kind of farm that could make a man feel small, a kingdom of soil and sweat ruled by those who held the land. Sheriff Jenkins had been to this place too many times. He remembered the heat of the summer sun on his neck as a boy riding his bicycle through the rows of corn, trying to avoid the long shadows cast by the tall, sturdy figure of Clay Becker. Back then, Clay had been a boy too, a few years older than him, already learning the ways of the land, with a sense of quiet authority that left no room for challenge. Back then, the Becker name was a quiet, solid thing, but over the years it had grown into something far more intimidating, an empire built not just on land, but on secrets, debts, and power. Sheriff Jenkins parked his truck in front of the Becker house, taking a long look at the place before stepping out. He didn't like what he was about to do, but there was no avoiding it. He had no choice but to face Clay, the man he'd known for most of his life, the man who had become something darker, something dangerous. This wasn't just about a missing child anymore. It was about something bigger, something that had been festering beneath the surface of this town for far too long. Inside, Clay Becker was sitting in the living room, staring out the window, his face hardened and unreadable. He was no longer the young man who had once been full of potential and quiet pride. Age had worn him down, made him suspicious angry. His once sharp eyes had grown dull, clouded by years of bitterness and resentment. He looked up as the sheriff entered, but didn't offer a greeting. "What brings you here?" Jenkins Clay's voice was low, gruff, like he was trying to hide the irritation in his tone. Sheriff Jenkins stepped inside, closing the door behind him. He was calm, professional, but there was an edge to his demeanor now. The headband Maggie had found weighed heavily in his pocket. He wasn't here for pleasantries. "I need to ask you some questions about Fiona Landry," Sheriff Jenkins said, his voice steady but firm. Clay's eyes flashed for just a second, something unreadable, something sharp. He quickly masked it with a sneer. Fiona Landry, Clay echoed as if the name was a distant memory. "What about her?" "That girl's been gone a decade. Everyone's moved on." Sheriff Jenkins didn't flinch. He stepped forward, his eyes locking onto Clay's. "I think you know something about her disappearance, Clay." "I found something at the Landry farm, a child's headband. Fiona's headband." Clay's jaw tightened, his hand curling into a fist at his side. His gaze dropped for a moment, as if he was gathering himself. "You don't know what you're talking about," he muttered, barely audible. "That's a decade ago. Nothing's gonna change now." Sheriff Jenkins leaned in, his voice low but sharp. "You've been quiet for too long, Clay. Too many years of hiding. I'm not leaving until I know the truth. Where is she?" The silence between them grew thick, oppressive. Finally, Clay let out a long, heavy sigh, as if the weight of all those years was pressing down on him. He stood up slowly, his body stiff, as though every movement had become an effort. "You really don't know, do you?" Clay said, his voice carrying a strange mixture of exhaustion and resentment. "You think this is just about a lost little girl? You think I took her for no reason?" Sheriff Jenkins didn't say anything, his gaze fixed on Clay's face. It wasn't like that. Clay continued, his voice shaking now just a little. "Fiona was lost. Just like I was, just like we all were. Her family, they don't know what it's like, what it feels like to lose everything. I didn't take her to hurt anyone. I just wanted—" He trailed off, his voice lost in the past. "Wanted what?" Clay Jenkins asked, his voice barely above a whisper, urging him to continue. Clay turned away, staring out the window once more. "I wanted to make it right, to fix what was broken, but I was too far gone. I couldn't stop. Once I had her—" His voice cracked. Sheriff Jenkins took a step closer, his heart pounding. "Where is she now, Clay?" Clay's eyes hardened again, and he turned to face the sheriff. There was a deep pain in his gaze, something almost human beneath the cold exterior. For a moment, Clay looked vulnerable, but it was fleeting. "She's gone," Clay said, his voice flat, empty. "She's where she's always been, and I don't think anyone's gonna find her now." The sheriff stood there for a long time, processing what Clay had just said. It was an answer, but not the one he had hoped for. It wasn't enough, but it was a start. Before Sheriff Jenkins could ask another question, Clay turned his back, walking toward the hallway. "Get off my property," he said, his voice thick with finality. Sheriff Jenkins left the Becker house without saying another word. The air outside felt colder now, the oppressive weight of the situation pressing down on him. He didn't know what Clay had been trying to say, but he knew one thing: the story wasn't over. There were too many gaps, too many inconsistencies. If Fiona was still out there, and if Clay Becker knew something, then the sheriff would find it, no matter how long it took. As he climbed back into his truck and started the engine, He glanced over at the field, the endless rows of corn stretching out before him. The farm, the town, the people, it all seemed like a quiet facade, masking something far darker beneath. And Sheriff Jenkins knew that the truth was buried somewhere out there in the vast, unforgiving land. He wasn't going to stop. Not now. Not when they were so close. The morning light filtered through the dense trees, casting long, muted shadows across the dirt road leading back to the Landry farm. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and wildflowers, and the quiet hum of the countryside settled like a blanket over the fields. But inside the small farmhouse, a storm of emotions was brewing. Maggie Landry sat at the kitchen table, her fingers nervously tracing the worn edges of a family photo. The image was old, weathered by years of wear, her Hank and Fiona at the edge of the cornfield, the summer sun bright above them. Fiona had been just a child then, her face full of laughter, her red hair catching the light. It was a moment of pure joy long before the nightmare began. But now the air was heavy with uncertainty. It had been days since they found Fiona, days of chaos, confusion, and slow, painful realization. The news had shaken the small town to its core. Maggie couldn't escape the questions. Everyone had their theories. They said things like, "You always knew something was wrong, and how could no one have seen it?" But the truth was no one had. Not even her. The fear she'd felt when Fiona first went missing, the feeling that something terrible was happening, she now knew it had been right, but it was too late. Maggie's mind kept racing over and over again, trying to fill in the gaps, the missing pieces of a puzzle that she had spent 10 years trying to forget. But Clay Becker's confession had opened the floodgates. He hadn't taken Fiona by accident. He hadn't just been holding her for a few days. No. Clay had kept her for years, slowly breaking her down in a place Maggie never thought to look, in the very heart of their own community. She stared at the photograph again, this time through tear-blurred eyes. Fiona was lost, stolen right in front of them. Maggie could feel the guilt twisting inside her each time she remembered how the town had passed it off as another tragic disappearance, a child lost in the fields, swept away by the wind never to return. And now, after all this time, Fiona was back. But she wasn't the same. Maggie had seen the fear in her daughter's eyes at the hospital. She had heard the soft, broken words Fiona spoke, asking why she had been locked away. Maggie had tried to hold it together, tried to reassure her that none of it was her fault. But the truth was, Fiona didn't recognize her. Hank walked into the room, his face drawn with exhaustion. He had spent the morning speaking with the authorities, piecing together the narrative of Fiona's disappearance and what Clay had revealed. His steps were slow as he approached Maggie, taking a seat beside her. The weight of the conversation was evident in his eyes, a heavy burden no one should have to bear. "How's she doing?" Maggie asked, her voice hoarse, strained. Hank sighed and ran a hand through his hair. "Better than she was, but still. She's not herself, Maggie. The doctors say it's going to take time. The trauma, the isolation. She's so confused, so scared. She remembers bits and pieces, but it's like her mind has locked away most of it." Maggie nodded, her heart aching. "She doesn't even remember us. Not really." "She remembers the dog," Hank replied softly, trying to offer something positive. "She remembers Rufus." Maggie's eyes softened, a small flicker of hope rising in her chest. Rufus had been their family dog, a German shepherd who had been Fiona's constant companion when she was little. That was a small victory, a thread of the past Fiona could still hold on to. "But the rest?" Maggie asked, her voice breaking. "The rest is all a blur, isn't it?" Hank didn't answer immediately. He couldn't put into words the cold realization that Fiona, their daughter, their flesh and blood, had been taken, tortured, and forced to live a life in the shadows, locked away from the world. All the while, the Becker name had been flourishing untouched, protected by the very people who should have been keeping watch. The question that had haunted Maggie's every waking moment was still unanswered. Why? Why had Clay Becker chosen to take Fiona? Was it revenge for some old petty grudge between their families, or was there something more to it? Maggie glanced up at Hank, her eyes dark with the weight of the unknown. What do you think, Hank? Do you think Clay really just did it to get back at us? Over some land dispute, Hank shook his head slowly, his mind churning with the same doubts. I don't know. I think there's more to it. I've been trying to piece it all together, and it doesn't add up. Clay's always been intense. But this goes beyond anything I imagined. Maggie's hand tightened around the photograph. He's been living here all this time, right under our noses. He was in town buying his groceries, talking to people. How could no one have seen it? Hank didn't have an answer for that. Instead, he leaned back in his chair, running his fingers through his hair. Maybe they did see something. Maybe they just didn't want to know. At that moment, the doorbell rang. Maggie stood up immediately, her heart racing. It was either more news about Fiona, or she wasn't sure which would be worse, another visit from the authorities. She wiped her eyes, trying to compose herself, and opened the door. Standing there at the doorstep was a tall man in his mid-50s, his face weathered by years of hard work. He was dressed in simple overalls and a flannel shirt, his hands calloused and strong. The expression on his face was somber, but there was something else in his eyes, something Maggie didn't recognize. Mrs. Landry, the man asked, his voice heavy with an accent she didn't recognize. I'm James Stokes. I worked with Clay Becker on the farm. We need to talk. James Stokes didn't wait for an invitation. He stepped inside without hesitation, and Maggie, caught off guard, glanced at Hank, who motioned for her to let him speak. We don't have much time, James said, his voice low, his eyes darting nervously around the room, as if expecting someone to overhear. I didn't want to come, but I can't let this go on. I know what Clay's done. I know what he's been hiding. Maggie felt her pulse quicken. She motioned for him to sit, but her mind was already racing. What do you know? James hesitated, as if weighing his words carefully. Then in a whisper he said, Clay's not the only one with secrets, Mrs. Landry. There's a lot more to Fiona's disappearance than you think. A lot more. James Stokes sat stiffly in the wooden chair, his hands clasped together tightly as he glanced nervously toward the window. The pale light of the afternoon sun filtered through the curtains, casting long shadows in the quiet room. Maggie's heart hammered in her chest as she waited for him to speak, each passing second stretching into an eternity. Hank, standing by the door, with his arms crossed, narrowed his eyes at James. You said you know more about what happened to Fiona. What's going on, James? His voice was tight, each word edged with frustration and growing fear. James sighed, the weight of what he was about to reveal pressing down on him. He looked at Maggie, his face hardening, before he leaned forward and spoke in a low, urgent tone. Clay, he didn't do this alone. James began, his voice barely above a whisper. There were others, people in this town who knew what was going on, but they stayed silent. They turned a blind eye. They didn't want to get involved. Maggie's breath caught in her throat. What do you mean? Who else? Who's been helping him? James hesitated, then seemed to make a decision. I don't have all the details, but I know Clay didn't keep Fiona locked up in that barn on his own. There's someone else, someone connected to the Beckers, someone powerful in this town. They've been covering for him for years. Hank's face turned pale, his mind racing to connect the dots. Who, he demanded. Who's been helping him? You need to tell us everything, James. James took a deep breath, clearly struggling with the decision to speak the truth. He leaned closer, his voice lowering even further. Sheriff Montgomery. He's been covering for Clay this whole time. I don't know how far it goes, but I know Clay had the sheriff in his pocket. He'd made sure nobody would find out about Fiona. He'd made sure no one would ever look at Clay's farm too closely. The name hit Maggie like a punch to the gut. Sheriff Montgomery. He had been the one who led the investigation when Fiona first went missing. The same man who had promised them answers, who had assured them that they would find their daughter. She felt sick. Are you saying... The sheriff knew all along. He knew Fiona was on that farm, and he did nothing. Maggie's voice cracked the pain of the betrayal so sharp it nearly stole her breath. James nodded grimly. That's exactly what I'm saying, and worse, he may have helped Clay keep her there. The room fell into a heavy silence, the weight of James' words sinking in. Maggie and Hank exchanged a look, the realization of just how deep the corruption ran, threatening to overwhelm them. How could they trust anyone now? Hank's voice broke the silence. How do you know all of this, James? Why are you telling us now? James looked away, guilt clouding his eyes. I tried to turn a blind eye. I tried to keep my distance. But I can't live with it anymore. Fiona's been through hell, and I've been part of that. I should have said something sooner. Maggie placed a trembling hand on the table, her voice steadier than she felt. If the sheriff's involved, it changes everything. We can't trust him to handle this investigation anymore. Exactly, James said, his voice firming. You're going to need to take this to the state police. They'll get you the help you need. This is too big for the local department now. Hank rubbed his face, his jaw tight with anger. We're going to make sure Clay doesn't get away with this. And if the sheriff's been in on it, we'll expose him too. Maggie could barely process what she was hearing. The small town she had known her whole life, the place where she and Hank had raised Fiona, was rotten to the core. Fiona's abduction hadn't just been a tragedy. It was the result of a network of lies and complicity. We'll go to the state. Maggie said, her voice filled with cold resolve. We're not letting this go. As James stood to leave, Maggie felt her chest tighten, the weight of what lay ahead, settling on her shoulders. There was so much to do. They had to find a way to break the grip Clay and the sheriff had over the town. They had to expose the truth, even if it meant tearing everything apart. But one thing was clear, there would be no turning back. Maggie's hands shook as she dialed the number on her phone. The light from the screen illuminated her tired face in the darkened room, casting shadows beneath her eyes. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Fiona's face, fragile, confused, broken. The weight of the world felt heavier than ever, but she couldn't stop now. She couldn't let this be the end. The phone rang 3 times before a voice on the other end answered. State Police Officer Delgado speaking. Maggie took a deep breath. Officer Delgado, my name is Maggie Landry. I need to speak with someone in charge immediately. It's about the Becker case. There was a long pause on the line, followed by a muffled voice. Hold on, Mrs. Landry. I'll connect you with Detective Sanders. The line went quiet, and Maggie felt her pulse quicken. This was it, the moment she had been waiting for. The stakes had just gotten much higher. When the phone clicked, a new voice spoke, calm and measured. Detective Sanders here. Mrs. Landry. I've been briefed on your case. How can we assist you? Maggie's breath hitched, but she steadied herself. I need to report a serious conflict of interest. The local sheriff Montgomery, he's been covering for Clay Becker. He's been involved in the disappearance of my daughter Fiona for the last 10 years. I have the information to prove it. There was a sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line. Mrs. Landry, are you sure about this? You understand the gravity of your accusation, I'm sure, Maggie replied, her voice unwavering. He's been helping Clay hide Fiona, covering up every step of the way, and I can prove it. We need to act fast. Clay's already confessed to his crimes, but I can't trust the local authorities to handle this anymore. Detective Sanders was silent for a moment, then spoke in a tone that held both caution and determination. We'll send a team to you first thing tomorrow morning. I want you and your husband to stay put and not speak to anyone else about this. You're dealing with powerful people here, and we need to move carefully. Maggie nodded, even though the detective couldn't see her. Understood. Thank you. As she ended the call, she let out a slow breath. The fight was far from over, but now at least she had help. She turned to Hank, who had been watching her from across the room, his face a mask of silent concern. We've got the state police on our side now, Maggie said, her voice steady but tinged with relief. Tomorrow we'll bring this whole thing to light. Hank came over and took her hand. We'll get through this, Maggie. Fiona, she'll get justice, and so will we. Maggie nodded, but the bitterness lingered. Sheriff Montgomery's betrayal burned through her thoughts like a poison. He had been a trusted figure in their small town, someone everyone relied on. Now, he was part of the problem. They sat together in the dim light of their living room, lost in their thoughts. Outside, the wind howled through the empty fields, rattling the windows. The quiet of the countryside had never felt so eerie. The fight was just beginning. Dawn broke over the small town, casting long shadows across the empty streets. The familiar light of day felt foreign to Maggie as she stood at the kitchen window, watching the fields stretch out before her. The stillness of the morning was punctuated by the occasional chirp of a bird, but the air was thick with anticipation, as though the land itself was holding its breath. Hank joined her, his face drawn with fatigue, but his eyes held a spark of determination. The events of the past week had taken their toll on them both. Maggie could see the weight of their shared grief etched in the lines of Hank's face. His hands, usually steady, trembled slightly as he reached for his coffee cup. "Do you think they'll come today?" Maggie asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Hank didn't answer immediately. He wasn't sure what to say. The sheriff had been a trusted figure in their town for years, someone who had been around since they were kids. But now, as Maggie had pointed out, there was a pattern that led straight to Clay Becker and to Sheriff Montgomery's possible involvement. The realization stung like a fresh wound. "I don't know," Hank said. Finally, his voice tinged with doubt. "But they're coming, and when they do, we need to be ready." By mid-morning, the sound of tires crunching over gravel broke the silence. Maggie's heart skipped a beat. A police car rolled into their driveway, followed by a second unmarked vehicle. Maggie and Hank exchanged a glance, and then they both stepped outside to greet the officers. Detective Sanders emerged first, his expression grim, followed by two other officers, one a tall woman with sharp eyes, the other a man who looked far too young to be carrying such weight. Their uniforms were crisp, their presence imposing. "Mrs. Landry," Detective Sanders said, his voice cool, but professional. "Mr. Landry, thank you for waiting. We've got a lot to cover." Maggie nodded, her stomach twisting with nerves. This was it, the moment they would take back control of the story. "We've already gathered some significant evidence," the detective continued, his voice steady. "But we need your help, both of you. We're going to move on Sheriff Montgomery and Clay Becker today. There's no going back now." The rest of the day was a blur of activity. The police had secured the area and began gathering statements, cross-referencing evidence, and preparing for a full-scale operation. Maggie and Hank were kept on standby, watching from the porch as the officers combed through the Becker property and Sheriff Montgomery's office. It felt surreal, this day that had once seemed like an impossible dream was now unfolding right in front of them. By late afternoon, Detective Sanders returned with a solemn look on his face. Maggie felt her heart lurch in her chest. "We've got everything we need," he said. "Sheriff Montgomery has been arrested. We've uncovered his involvement in the cover-up, and we're moving forward with charges against him. As for Clay, we've found the rest of the evidence we needed to make sure he faces justice for everything he's done to Fiona." Maggie didn't know what to feel, relief, anger, or perhaps a mix of both. The truth had come to light, but the road to justice wasn't over yet. There would be trials, legal battles, and difficult questions ahead. But for the first time in 10 years, Maggie felt something that had been absent for far too long: hope. As the evening fell and the officers began to leave, Maggie and Hank stood side by side on the porch, watching the sun dip below the horizon. The nightmare was far from over, but it was no longer the only thing that defined their lives. "We did it, Hank," Maggie whispered, her voice thick with emotion. Hank squeezed her hand. "We did it together." And so, with Fiona's future uncertain, but her safety no longer in question, Maggie and Hank knew that their fight was only just beginning. But they had found strength in each other, and in the knowledge that no matter the cost, they would never stop fighting for their daughter.